Hello and welcome back to another edition of CloseMode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, and today I'm really lucky to be with Max MacCready, who's the Director of Direct Sales for Jellyvision. And for those of you who don't know, Jellyvision is an uncommonly delightful way to manage benefits. Max, welcome to the show.
Brian, thank you for having me. And I will say thank you for calling us Jellyvision and not Jellyfish. Like we talked about before, it is very common for people to interchange the two to the point where maybe we should just lean into it at this point. But appreciate it nonetheless, and glad to be here. Excited to be here.
So a bit. We're going to jump into our topic here in a second, but I find it interesting that Jellyfish Vision was what your origins were. Super Mario Kart or something like this.
Yeah. So it dates all the way back to the late 80s, early 90s. We started off as Learn Television, where our founder, Harry Gottlieb, was making educational videos for kids in the classroom. Eventually, he decided, you know what? The video stops at the end of the class. And at that point, engagement stops. I want to keep going, though. I want to be able to reach through the screen. So that's eventually when we pivoted to making video games of all things, educational video games. And that's eventually how the greats like You Don't Know Jack and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire were born. You can still see remnants of that with Jackbox Games. For those of you who were stuck inside during the pandemic, which was pretty much all of us, you likely played one of those games and had some fun with the family. So from there, though, we went from Learn Television to being called Jellyvision and did a bunch of side projects as well as lab type projects before eventually getting reached out to by a larger carrier within the medical space. And they said, hey, we're seeing everything you're doing with interactive conversations, with decision support. You guys ever think about getting into healthcare and benefits? And the rest has been history since then.
I find it a fascinating background. So you and I were chatting the other week, and it still kind of blows me away. We hit upon an issue that is ages old related to selling, and I was mentioning to you earlier today. I've stumbled on two of these instances very recently in my old business, and I'm shocked that we're still talking about this. But the thing that you mentioned is that there's this idea out there in sales that if you're not talking to the decision maker, you're wasting your time. So tell me, what's your perspective on this? I know you have one.
Yeah, you know what? Candidly, it's just not true. If anything, you should be focusing less on having to always talk to the, quote unquote decision maker and more on making the most of the time you eventually get with them. Very rarely are you going to start a sales motion talking to, again, the decision maker. And I'll get to why I'm using air quotes around that. Because in reality, we no longer have one decision maker. It's a committee of decision makers. And frankly, if you're starting directly with the historical decision maker, which is usually your VP or higher type title, then you're really setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be my next question. That I think that's sort of the root cause problem of this is just the notion of decision maker. In essence, is just given what is it 6.7 people per buy, committee buys, very complex buys. That very notion is kind of dead. I think maybe in some instances, right, it's still there, but by and large, with enterprise selling, no.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're no longer in this era of having only one decision maker. There truly are multiple. It's a committee, and I know I'm not saying anything super revolutionary here, since every sales playbook and social influencer is shouting this, as well. However, it's still worth reiterating nonetheless. And instead, we should really be focusing on talking to everyone else around that historical quote unquote decision maker and turning them into champions and mobilizers, really in order to gain better insight into the problems or challenges that the team is facing, how it's impacting everyone from that individual that you're talking to, the team as a whole, the company as a whole. That way, when we do get in front of that, VP or higher type title, two things happen. Either one, they're really impressed with how well you understand their business and your ability to tailor the conversation and potential solution to their hyper specific need. And two, they're likely already bought into a degree because you've taken the time to talk to their people that report to them, that champion or mobilizer that you've been building a foundational relationship with. And that person's already sharing information ahead of you meeting with that VP or higher type title and commenting on your ability to actually solve that problem.
there is a real issue that there are in our business, just the way we sell, we tend to think of thought leaders, right? There might be 6 or 7 people on the other side, but who it's Max and this other woman over here. Those are the two that everybody listens to, and I feel like that's more reflective of the world today. That there is some thought leader that their votes are going to be kind of more than others, but there is a real issue around being blocked, though. Let's not say from the decision maker, but from a key influencer or a thought leader we want to get to. What are your thoughts around when we're getting blocked?
Well, I mean, we can choose to either dig in or go around our current contact. Both options have their pros and cons, right? However, in my opinion, one is definitely the better option overall. But before we even decide to choose a path, either dig in or go around, we really should take a second to reflect. Am I actually getting blocked, or maybe I haven't done my job and haven't proven the value yet to gain access to more of these people, or maybe there's even things outside of my control as the seller that I need to seek to understand. Before talking about going around anybody, we should really break down those two other examples I just mentioned, starting with not having proven enough value yet. To me, this really means you haven't done your job as a salesperson, right? You haven't gotten enough buy in from the person you're speaking with in order to turn them into a champion, to be able to get you to that next level, to be able to mobilize and bring in the people that need to be brought in. And that's likely because you haven't really taken the time to identify a significant pain to be able to solve for and therefore align your solution accordingly. So, rather than taking any further action, rather than trying to go around this individual that you're talking to, the first question, to the person that you're speaking with should sound something like, hey, we've had, at this point, maybe 1, 2, 3 calls, and I notice you still don't want to involve other people. Have I missed the mark in explaining how what we can do can help you with X? Really just taking that time to dig in, figure it out. Don't pass go until you do so. And then there's the other side here where, there are likely things that are outside of your control as a seller that if we're doing our job right, we should be seeking to understand at all times, right? Let's say at this point, Brian, you're in a sales motion with somebody and you've done the perfect discovery call. You found the perfect pain point that aligns all the way up to a company initiative that needs to be solved for. And your solution can be tailored accordingly to be able to help solve for it. And yet the person you're speaking with is still unwilling to move things along, right? We should be seeking to understand why that's the case, given that we've already built a solid business case around this, as well as a foundational relationship with this individual. And so, a question we could be asking is something even as simple as, "Hey, Brian, what's preventing us from bringing this forward now?" And that's where we can learn. Maybe it turns out the CFO literally just yesterday put out a mandate freezing all new spend that you just haven't heard about yet, or maybe you have a really savvy buyer who's trying to set you up for success because they've bought technology and or software and or solutions for their company before, and they're just trying to make sure that you're set up for success. Really, point being here is that unless we remain genuinely curious and seek to understand, we end up assuming. And I mean, I'm sure the good old saying, what they say about assuming, right?
I'm going to harken back to, and I think this is from strategic selling, like Miller Hyman stuff, saying that basically a lot of people block you because they don't see a win in it for them. And that's always been super simple for me to think of it that way and say that does make sense to me if someone's not going to get you there. So how do you, like, when we're selling, we try to go for what we call sponsored access. Like if you're blocking me, it's like I got to figure out what is a win for you, a reason for you to actually bring me to other people, and we find that pretty helpful. So I do have a question for you about let's talk about examples. One of the ways we started talking about this, as you mentioned, one of your teammates was basically saying, "Hey, I'm just going to damn the torpedoes and go over this person's head because I'm not at the decision maker level," right?
Yeah, you know what? It was funny. It was very timely, our conversation, because right before our initial conversation, I was in a one-on-one with a team member who has a deal that they've been working now for months and months and months. They've built a foundational relationship with the individual that truly has otherwise become, a champion and mobilizer. However, things have been a little stale the last 2 months or so. We keep on getting messages back of, "Hey, you know what? Hold tight, hold tight." Without naming any names, I can say that this is a government entity. So hearing hold tight isn't all too surprising when we're talking to government entities, right? Like that sales cycle in and of itself is just going to be long and drawn out regardless. But at this point, I have my seller coming back to me in our one-on-one saying, "Hey, I'm okay holding tight, but at this point, what are your thoughts? Should I start getting worried? The fact that, it's been a couple months now that we haven't been able to move forward, there hasn't been anybody else looped in. And we started to break down the pros and cons and say, hey, you know what? Okay, what are the pros of you going around this person that has otherwise really helped us to build a business case, right? What are the pros here? It's like, well, I get an answer on what's going on. It's like, okay, let's make note of that. You said I. What happens? What are some of the cons? Okay, well, the person I'm working with, gets really offended and it blows up the deal. And ultimately, they don't get the solution that they were otherwise looking for because I've completely eroded the trust that I've otherwise built up. It's like, okay, let's take note of the they, them, us type verbiage that we're using there. Notice that the quote unquote pro of going around your champion and mobilizer to date is that you get an answer. It's a very selfish outlook, right? Versus the con, it impacts both you and the person that you've been working with and really blows up something that otherwise could have been a great scenario where you got your person looking great in front of their boss because they're bringing a solution and you're getting a sale and the commission as a result. So that's where, again, I ask that we have reflection, before we decide to go around somebody, because ultimately there's really only one true use case where it makes sense to go around somebody. And that's where, there being a true blocker, where the individual you're talking to has selfish motivation in order to prevent you from moving forward. And that could be something like, oh, you know what? Your solution has the potential to, replace my job, which nowadays that's rarely ever the case. If anything, it'll augment somebody's job, right? In terms of solutions. But nonetheless, like that's a very hyper specific example. And even then, you want to have a very unique approach to how you go about going around the individual in order to create a win-win scenario. And that often looks something like, let's say, for example, we're talking about my seller who sells into HR teams. They're talking to a benefits manager, and they report directly into the CHRO. We've identified that this benefits manager ultimately doesn't want to move us forward because they're afraid of our solution replacing them, even though, again, never the case. But nonetheless, we've been able to truly identify that is truly the case for why we can't move forward. In which case, then I might send a message to the CHRO, but it's not going to sound something like, oh, you know what? I've been talking to Brian and he's refusing to move things forward. This is why I think you should fire Brian and get our solution in place. No, it's going to sound something more like, hey, you know what? I've had the pleasure of speaking with Brian. You got a real, smart cookie on your team. Can't sing enough praises about him. Here's what we've been talking about so far. Looking forward to continuing the conversation with Brian. Just wanted to keep you apprised to, the conversations we've had so far. And really, two things happen there. One, you got your CHRO that is sitting there going, huh, okay, yeah, Brian's working on this in the background and that looks really great. And then they're going to go back to Brian over here and say, hey, Max reached out to me and told me about all the good conversation and good work you guys have been doing. How come I haven't heard about this yet? And then that puts, the individual I've been talking to on the spot to say, oh, well, you know what? Like, I just haven't, fully vetted it out yet. I wanted to bring it to your attention when it made sense. And then that person will come back to you, maybe a little bit flustered, annoyed, maybe pissed off at first, but then ultimately realizing that, hey, you know what? I have a very selfish opportunity to make myself look good here, right? But again, that's a very hyper specific scenario to where it makes sense to, otherwise jeopardize the trust and foundational relationship that you've been building along the way with your initial buyer.
It's interesting too because what comes to mind as I listen to you is two scenarios we've been in lately, and kind of the reverse, where we've had executive sponsorship at a high level in two places, and one of those we sold at the executive level, and technology we missed the security people. Right, we didn't spend enough time with them, and now they're like, they are cleaning our clock, and they are clearly not happy with the way this deal went down. And we looked at our sales process stages, and now we're a tech company, right? But we're a startup, so we went back and more clearly delineated, that the tech review as a more clearly delineated process step. Another similar scenario, again, executive sponsorship at a very high level. We missed a key influence, and our executive sponsor was saying, you don't need to do all of this like needs analysis work and all of this discovery. Like, I'm in, I'm ready to go. and we almost got blocked by somebody. I'm talking at the CRO level, and somebody at the sales enablement level almost blocked us. And with that one we got fixed by just getting to that person and saying, forget, we know there's sponsorship for this thing. We're not even sure there's a fit yet. Tell us, give us everything that's happening at your desk right now. What are you struggling with? But yeah, so it's different, right? Because we start talking about how do you get to the decision maker, and then morphed into there really isn't a decision maker. And yeah, that can get you in trouble as well, right? When you just got that top down thing.
Well, exactly. And I mean, you bring up an interesting point because in both scenarios, you started with, a C-level individual, right? And I mentioned earlier, like that's setting yourself up for failure because nothing against my C-levels out there. Absolutely love you to death. Shout out to, my C-level over here at Jellyvision. But here's the thing, at times the C-level doesn't necessarily have full line of sight into the day to day. Rather, that's our job as frontline managers, as middle managers, as directors to be able to ensure that everything is working and operating, soundly and smoothly. So that way, our C-level doesn't have to worry about that on a day-to-day basis. So that's where you could get yourself into trouble. And although, you have something bright, shiny, interesting that otherwise grabs the attention of the C-level, if we start there, then we run into exactly what you mentioned here. We miss things like tech reviews. We miss things like looping in sales enablement because they're the ones who are going to have to roll this out eventually anyway, right? So even in those instances, though, that's where if we do end up starting out with a C-level, we really need to make sure that we inevitably take a step back and take time to build. Again, I keep on coming back to this phrase because I hammer it home with my team, but that foundational relationship. In fact, it's reminding me of a scenario that we didn't get to talk about previously, but I actually had a sale with a university over in the South. So I actually had the opportunity to start a sales motion with the chief human resources officer. And during that time, I was lucky enough that CHRO had a true beat on what was going on. We were able to have a very solid conversation about the challenges that they were facing, the solution that we could potentially bring to the table. And as a result, by the end of the conversation, I had gained enough trust with the CHRO that they were able to tell me, hey, you need to now go to my team and really vet it out with them. Because as much as you have me bought in, if they say no, you're not passing go.
And I love that point, Max. Yeah, it's funny. I was just scribbling that down that they may not be the yes decision makers, but they can say no, and they can completely screw it all up. Yeah. So that the other thing I wonder how you feel about this. There are occasions, and this I haven't done recently because I made the mistake a couple times and didn't want to do it again. But engaging when you've got someone who's ready to say yes and ready to sign up, executing that kind of cross-functional due diligence up front. What we've found is that is thinking about implementation, rollout, and adoption of whatever this initiative is, that the more you engage people on the upfront buy side and they're part of the decision, the higher the probability of a really well adopted rollout on the back end. And I have a sense you might agree with that, but that's one of the reasons we will never skip it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's something that, especially when you look at something like our sales motion over here at Jellyvision, you know, even when we're having initial conversations, if we start to get the sense of, okay, you know what, we have alignment, we're turning the current individual that we're speaking with into a champion as well as potentially mobilizer. So we need to make sure that we're helping to look out for them, right? Because oftentimes you have one of two individuals that you're speaking to, someone that has either bought technology or a solution or software before, so they know the steps that they need to go through internally in order to not only get buy-in but then also get sign off. Or you got someone who is super green and has never done this before, in which case it's really our job as the seller to be a consultant in that case and be like, hey Brian, like usually as a next step from here, what I would recommend is that we get a demo set up. But if this is something that you're serious about moving on within, the foreseeable future, we can also just start proactively working on this needs analysis or this tech review in the background. No skin off of our back, but you're going to run into this. And as much as you don't think it's going to be a big deal, I guarantee, just having worked with other individuals who have been in your shoes, that it's going to clog up the wheels for you and you're not going to be able to move anywhere eventually once we get to the point where we want to be able to execute. And by being that proactive, we ultimately either educate the person who hasn't been a buyer before and it's their first go around, or we truly come off as that consultant, as that knowledgeable individual, and gain that much more trust with the person that we're talking to because we're already beating them to the punch and saying exactly what they were going to say next.
It's interesting too because we were in the one instance where we were at the CRO level. I found myself selling that individual to slow things down, which is very funny as the seller. He's saying, "Hey, I'm ready. I got the budget for the licenses. Let's go." And it's like, no, it's really you don't want to do that. So it's, I mean, this is an age old problem. And when you and I started talking about it the other day, I was like, really, we're still wrestling with this. But you had examples in the organization. I have examples of mine of either again, sort of having that top down support and skipping key stakeholders or being stuck down here and being blocked from getting to them. That, this is about both getting the deal done properly and then implementing and roll out properly. It, in fact, impacts everything.
Yeah, it really does, and I'll even bring up the example that we talked about before, which is I've been speaking to a number of vendors this year that have all these different solutions for improving our sales motion and or the back end admin process, and I was speaking to this organization that did a really good job of leveraging their connections to be able to get connected to my CRO. At which point, my CRO looped me in. We had that initial conversation, and past that point, I had said, hey, you know what? My CRO is going to take a back seat. I'm going to continue conversations with you all to further vet you out, and then I'll bring them back in when it makes sense. And having been through the buying process internally here at Jellyvision before, I know what steps need to be taken. I know, the type of business case that needs to be drawn up. And I also know that, when we're looking at something like our tech stack right now, it's something that we're being very judicious with our spend, just like every other sales organization likely nowadays. And so I end up having conversations with the account executives on that team. We had previously started conversations with really the head of sales, but since I had said, hey, let me be the one to drive here for a bit, we had the account executives for that team get looped in. And in speaking with the account executives, it was a no brainer for me. I was like, this solution makes all the sense. Frankly, I'm kind of mad that we hadn't talked like 6 months ago because I would have tried to get you guys in for this year to make an impact. But that's the thing. I want you to be able to make an impact and I want to set you up for success. Having gone through this motion before, I need you to trust me when I say now isn't the time, but here's what the next steps are going to be. It's always interesting, like selling into salespeople, right? Like I'm sitting here thinking, like, okay, I'm just going to give them the roadmap for how they're going to succeed. And if they choose to take it and run with it, then they will, right? If they go against it, not so much. And what ended up happening was that I had alignment with their account executives who were like, hey, you know what? Makes sense based on what you're describing. If we tried to get in now, we'd be setting ourselves up for failure, and we'd have you churn as a customer a couple months later because timing is just off in terms of being able to see that value come to fruition. And so we had alignment, we set up next steps. I basically gave them the next steps to say like, hey, connect with me in June, this is what we'll talk about then, and here's how we'll continue the conversation. Again, because as the buyer, I'm bought in. I understand the value. I'm already thinking about the business case here, how to set everyone up for success. Come to find a week later that the original head of sales, who was a part of that original call with my CRO, went behind my back to my CRO and led with information that was only about like a third true. And that rubbed me the wrong way because ultimately could definitely tell that somebody got, commission breath going on. They want to try and get this done. And it's like, okay, yeah, timing's a portion of it, but there are a lot of other things that I said to your sales team members that would otherwise impact us from being able to move forward right now. So the fact that you went around me, who I've already identified myself as someone who has bought before here at my company, I know the process, I know who to loop in when, I know the motions that we have to go through, the tech reviews we have to go through, all of this. I need you to trust me. Either one of two things happen. Either the head of sales heard this and still decided to just, throw that to the side and try and like steamroll things forward, or they chose not to listen to their salespeople and instead tried again to steamroll and do things on their own timeline. Which, again, thankfully, the account executives I spoke to, were great enough to where I'm willing to give a second shot here when we reconnect in June. But man, let me tell you, the amount of times I had to rewrite an email that was kept internal just to say like, hey, like I'm actually very upset that this happened, and I don't want this to reflect on like my ability to make decisions here. The amount of times I had to rewrite that and have AI help me to tone it down, I can't even tell you, Brian.
I was going to ask if you schooled them, so good for you. Yeah, again, this is you and I both have examples of mistakes we've made ourselves, and now you're talking about someone selling to you that made the same mistake, and anybody who's listening, watching might say, "Come on, this is an issue. It's been around forever, and we're still wrestling with it today." So I really appreciate you bringing it up, and I love talking about street level issues on this podcast, and we made that call up front to let's look at these because they're still there. So yeah, you are super generous with your time and your ideas, and I think hopefully people will listen to this and just do a little scan of your own organization and find out there's so much inertia in the DNA of us as sellers, going way back when, even to our forefathers, about go fast and go hard. You know what I mean? So I think we've got to stop and objectively think about this as you and I have done today, because there still is some of that going on.
Well, and I'll also just put out a PSA as well too, because oftentimes when we have sellers making these decisions to go around, the either champion or mobilizer that they've otherwise been building this relationship with, it's usually because either they themselves have commission breath, which ultimately spells doom for everything, or their sales manager that they report to has commission breath. In which case, then they feel the pressure from above to get things moving along. In which case, you're risking the potential to blow up an otherwise very good deal. And so that's where I'll put out a PSA even for my fellow sales managers and directors out there, that as much pressure as you're feeling, even from above you to, hey, we need to get sales now, we need to have more consistency, we need to make sure that, we're bringing in things on a more regular basis. When you know that you have an enterprise level sale and that sales cycle is inevitably going to be drawn out and longer, it's really your job as that frontline manager or director to help filter that noise from above. So that way, then your salespeople that report to you aren't getting the jitters of, okay, now I have all this pressure to close it now. It's like, no, if we start introducing those jitters, that's where we get these mistakes being made and we get deals getting blown up that have otherwise been worked on for months. And instead, we should really seek, again, to be genuinely curious and understand, hey, why are we, supposedly stuck right now? What is the reason behind that? Have we been actually asking our, buyers what the reason behind that is? And that's where, again, if we're able to seek to understand, we're likely to get answers that would satisfy not only the sales rep, but then also the manager and the people above the manager, to where then you have people less on your back about that particular sale.
I've heard this theme across several professionals like yourself I've spoken with lately about not your words, but the kind of slow down to hurry up thing. I think people are beginning to understand that this push, drive, like, yeah, we need a certain degree of that for sure, but it's also problematic. There are times to slow down, develop that other stakeholder. Even if an executive sponsor is telling you no, or don't take the time to power through that lower level person, work with them. Ultimately, I think that ends up in more closed deals and better deals down the road. So yeah, again, thank you so much for your time and for sharing to this community of pros, so we can all learn from one another. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Brian. It's been an absolute pleasure, and can't wait to hear this go up, as well as the future podcasts that you'll be leading here as well too. Been a big fan in the background here, so glad to be on today.
Cool. Well, we're happy to have someone from Jellyfish here. Thank you very much.
And there it is. Appreciate you, Brian.
Take care, man.
You too.